Fed is the central bank. The central banking authority of the nation determines the size of the money supply. In the United States, that's the Federal Reserve System. Is it possible that you might get questions on that test about the nature of the Federal Reserve System, the structure of the Federal Reserve System? Maybe. I mean, you have a familiarity with that. Now, what's the most important thing about the Fed? The most important thing about the Fed is they control the money supply. Oh, incidentally, through what aspect or what component of the Fed is most of the money supply controlled? We said within the Fed there is these different parts. There are the member banks. There's the Federal Reserve Board. There are the presidents of the banks. But there is this important committee within the Fed. And this is where the size of the money supply is kind of manipulated. Anybody remember? No, it's 12, right? The Fed Open Market Committee, right? So it's through the Open Market Committee that the Fed controls the money supply, right? Now, what can the Fed do? Well, the Fed, through open market operations, can increase the size of the money supply, or it can decrease the size of the money supply, right? Or it can keep it the same. Now, if the Fed decides to increase the size of the money supply, what happens? Well, here's the money supply, here's the demand for money, here's the equilibrium interest rate, right? Now, this equilibrium interest rate, we would suggest, is an important thing, right? You know, we hear about it all the time. Interest rates, interest rates, interest rates, that's what we're talking about. So let's say the Fed decides that it's going to increase the size of the money supply. Well, okay. It moves the size of the money supply from this quantity, quantity 1, to quantity 2. Now, what do we see happens? The equilibrium interest rate goes down, right? Now, if we go over here and we say, all right, if the Fed decides that they are going to increase the money supply, right, which they did there, then the effect of increasing the money supply is to drive interest rates down. Right? Now, if interest rates go down, how does that affect C plus I?
Mr. Raymond, do you have a sound in the office, please? Mrs. Raymond, to the office for a phone call, please.
Yes. We would suggest the most likely component is that investment spending would increase. Now, if investment spending increases, aggregate demand goes up. So now, when would I want to do that? What circumstance in the economy would I want to do that? If I'm in a recession, right? Now, you can count on this. You can count on that test, them putting you into some sort of circumstance. Okay, unemployment is this, inflation is this, you know, this is what it is, you know, they're going to put you in some circumstance. And then you can count on them saying, okay, what's that look like? Right? Now, when you draw that, you're going to, you know, they may say, what's it look like in the short run? They may say what it looks like in the long run. You know, I mean, certainly you can have a recession in the short run. You can have demand pull inflation in the short run. But what you can't have in the long run is a level of output below some level that would fully employ all risks. You got full employment in the long run. So it might ask you to drop. But inevitably they're going to say, okay, what are the policies? What could you do about this? Right? If you believed in monetary policy, what could you do? Right? You know, I mean, if you believe in fiscal policy, what could you do? What effect would that have? They might even say, what's one thing that would sort of inhibit this? Right? You know, and in this case, what might inhibit this is, okay, if interest rates go down, firms don't necessarily have to respond by investing more. We kind of think they will, but they don't have to. Right? And that might result in this not really being as effective as it could be. All right, let's do this real quick. All right. Now, what if the Federal Reserve says, oh my goodness, we don't want to increase the money supply, we want to decrease it. Now what's going to happen? Well, now, remember they've changed the quantity of money to here. Now we have a higher equilibrium interest rate. So now what they did is they took the money supply, they reduced the money supply. The effect of that was to raise the interest rate, and the effect of that would be to drive investment spending down. Why would you want to do that if you had inflation? Right? Now that's kind of simple monetary policy, right? That's kind of simple monetary policy. Now, when the Fed does this, change this, where you move from here to here or whatever, change the money supply, what we said in class is they do that through manipulating the banking system. What they do is alter the size of bank excess reserves. So, just for fun, maybe we can talk about this. Let me just go over it really quickly. So let me give you the context of this. Okay, so the Fed is going to manipulate the money supply. And when the Fed manipulates the money supply, you know what we call that? Monetary policy. Right? So it gets down to this. If the Fed is going to, they increase it, they decrease it, right? And if they increase or decrease the money supply for the purpose of kind of adjusting the macroeconomy, we call that monetary policy, correct? Now, how do they do that, right? Well, the way they do it is by altering the size of bank excess reserves. What's a bank excess reserve? Well, let's do this. We have a bank, right? And the bank has a balance sheet. And on the balance sheet it has assets, right, and liabilities. Right? Now, this bank, has assets and liabilities, and we went through a big thing about this. But we said, well, what if people come along and they deposit money in the bank? Right? They deposit $100,000. What is that? An asset or a liability? So it's both, right? Because if they deposit $100,000 in the bank and they put it in checking accounts, then there's $100,000 in the bank's demand deposits. A liability is something that someone has a claim on. So if people deposit money in a bank, the people who deposit have a claim on that money. I can write a check and order the bank to pay somebody paid to the orderer, right? People have a claim to that asset. Right, but it's to that asset. It's also an asset because the bank now has in its vaults $100,000. Right? Now, okay, if this is true, if this is the status of the bank, what we said is this bank can have in its vault $100,000, and it is required at any given time to pay out $100,000 to its depositors. But this bank finds that it can be safe by only holding a fraction of its reserves. So how much does it have on reserve? $100,000, right? How much does it need to hold on reserve? Well, the Fed here is going to determine something called the reserve ratio, which is a percent.
Mr. Vigo, you have a phone call in the office, please. Mr. Vigo, to the office, please, for a phone call.
It's a percent of the total deposits. So how much do we have there on total deposits? We've got $100,000, right? How much of that must we hold on reserve? Well, we've got to hold 20% of this. Right? So what's that mean? That means that we've got to hold $20,000 in cash. What can we do with the rest of it? We can loan it out. So let's say, all right, let's loan out $20,000 in cash. Let's make a loan for $80,000.